It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. I'm Amina Serna, filling in for Brian today. You don't need me to tell you that New Yorkers have strong opinions about their bagels and pizza. This story may test some of them. If you've ever wondered why a New York bagel tastes different from a bagel you get anywhere else in the country, chewier and denser, part of the answer might be the use of a chemical called potassium bromate. It's a flour additive that's been used by commercial bakers for decades to strengthen dough and improve the texture. It also happens to be classified as a possible human carcinogen, and it's been banned from the European Union, the United Kingdom, Canada, and several other countries. New York State is now considering joining them. So, will our beloved pizza and bagels be knocked down a peg? We'll spend the last few minutes of the show today talking about this with Julia Moskin, food reporter for the New York Times, and we will take your calls. Julia, welcome back to WNYC.
Thank you so much.
And listeners, we want to hear from you. If you make pizza or bagels for a living and you're listening right now, we want to hear from you. What does bromated flour actually mean to your operation? Would you welcome this ban, or does it worry you? And more broadly, New Yorkers, how much does it matter to you that your bagels taste like New York bagels? 212-433-WNYC. That's 212-433-9692. You can call or text. So what does this potassium bromate actually do to flour, and how did it become such a common additive in commercial baking?
Right. So let me just say first that if you are someone who makes pizza or bagels at home, first, hats off to you. But second, you do not have to worry about this ban. This really only applies to commercial doughs, and it only applies to bread flours. Potassium bromate is just one of many, many, shortcuts and helpers and what are called dough improvers that were invented in the 20th century and made it much more foolproof to create a dough, right? Anything sourdough, anyone who's ever baked a loaf of sourdough knows how finicky bread can be. So it kind of takes the guesswork out of it, makes it possible for commercial bakeries to have less food waste, fewer employees, less sort of employee education, because it makes the dough very reliable.
And it's been listed now as a possible carcinogen. So, Julia, what do we know about the types of cancer this ingredient is linked to?
It's a bit nonspecific. I think there is concern about thyroid and kidney cancers. The study was done in 1982, and it hasn't really been followed up. This is sort of a case in which, if it's a possible carcinogen, why would we use it? Why would we have it? There are other options. The reason that it becomes to be such an issue with pizza and bagels in New York is because there is such a mystique about these bread products and their special combination of how crunchy they have to be and how chewy they have to be and how foldable the pizza has to be. And people sometimes say, oh, it's the water, or, oh, it's the fact that New York is at sea level. But potassium bromate and bromated flour is widely used across the states in commercial baking. California has a ban that's going to go into effect in 2027. And this New York State bill, which has already passed the Senate and the Assembly, would do the same thing.
We have a listener who's been hanging on. She says she works at a policy org that is behind this ban. Megan in Brooklyn, you're on WNYC. Hi, Megan.
Hi, good morning. So I work for the Center for Science and the Public Interest. We're an advocacy org that supports this bill, and we have been for a few years. And I also live in Brooklyn. Like you said, the World Health Organization says that potassium bromate is a genotoxic carcinogen, and that means it can theoretically cause cancer at any dose. And I think it's important to note the FDA, our food regulatory agency, has not looked at the safety of this chemical since the 70s. And that's before the WHO made this conclusion about it being a genotoxic carcinogen based on studies in the 80s and 90s. So in a city that runs on bagels and pizza, I just don't think that those foods should have an ingredient that can cause cancer. And Julia, for the piece on this, a lot of the comments are from bagel and pizza shop owners that don't use potassium bromate. I saw H&H Bagels. They don't use this chemical. Their bagels are still really low price, and they taste great. So we're really hopeful that the governor will sign this bill. There might be a little more guesswork for these shops that have to figure out how to change their recipe, but I think that change will be a really positive one if it means that the foods that New Yorkers are eating every day will be a little bit safer.
Megan, thank you so much for your call. And yeah, Julia, I mean, you reported on some pizza makers who, or one pizza maker in particular who grew up at her father's slice shop in the Bronx, and she told you that she already switched to unbromated flour and figured it out. So how did she do it?
Well, she added, it's a lot of tinkering, right? As it always is with bread. So I think she ended up adding a little bit of sugar and a little bit of olive oil for pliability. These really old school places like her father's, Louie and Ernie's in the Bronx, were, opened in an age where people were not really worried about, with the ingredients or in their food, both from a health perspective and really just from a taste perspective. And now we have all of these, slow risen artisanal pizza places. Those places would never dream of using flour with potassium bromate. It just makes things quicker. Louie and Ernie's is like a slice shop in the Bronx that has a big after school market, and you've got to get that dough out fast. You've got to get those pizzas in and out of the oven. And potassium bromate is the kind of thing that helps that happen. But that's sort of not the direction that people like Tori and a lot of other pizza makers are moving. It's much more toward, of course, all natural, organic, even local flours without, these kinds of dough improvers and dough conditioners that commercial bakers have relied on for a long time.
And a bagel maker that you spoke to, whose family has been at it since 1981, says that the prices are going to go up from $2 to $3 or $4, and that customers are going to be furious. So can you talk about sort of that tension there?
Well, that is kind of a doomsday scenario. I think that's at Utopia Bagels, which is like my house bagel. And, the thing there is that, their Jesse's grandfather opened Utopia Bagels in the 40s, and nothing has changed since then. And it's just really a question of the unknown. It's being forced to move into the unknown. And there are just so many factors in making a New York bagel or any bagel or really any bread. There is temperature, there is humidity, there is length of the rise and the fermentation, and all of these things have to be carefully controlled. So if you change even one component, sometimes it can make a big difference. I don't think there's any universe in which, these bagels will really change in a way that is perceptible to consumers. I feel confident that the bagel and pizza makers of New York will figure it out. But, for someone like Jesse, who's a third generation custodian of this brand, he feels a lot of pressure.
Listener asks, what about commercial brands of bread bought in the supermarket? Would potassium bromate be listed in the ingredients? Do you know?
They are not required to disclose whether flour is bromated or not. It is required, I believe, maybe Megan can correct me, that it does say it has to say whether the flour is bleached or unbleached. Bromated for bread flour was just kind of the default. So I'm not sure that you would necessarily know, but I think that you can assume that any bread that you buy in a supermarket, if it doesn't say otherwise, is probably made from bromated flour.
Okay, so Julia, you were talking about sort of the prevailing myth that New York City bagels and pizza taste this way because of what's in the water or the bromated flour. But a listener asks, I think, a pretty hard-hitting question. They write, New York bagels taste different from bagels from outside New York. The only ban in the U.S. is in California. Why would bagels in Connecticut be so terrible tasting if potassium bromate is legal in Connecticut? So shots fired. Sorry, Connecticut. But
Ouch.
what is it? I mean, can we get to the bottom of it?
Oh, there is so much that goes into making bagels. A bagel is very, very different from a standard loaf of white bread or even sourdough. A bagel is slow risen. They are twisted in a particular way that is conducive to the rise. They are risen and then they are boiled, which is sort of the key step. This is what makes bagels and pretzels have that kind of shiny, chewy crust, and that is a very high labor operation. It's really never been possible to. Um, that's why there aren't really good bagel chains because it really requires a lot of expertise to make a bagel and a lot of equipment and a lot of skilled staff. Now, some of that is changing because, of course, there is a lot of technology that is rising up to make it possible. You can do a lot with a steam oven, and there are a lot of new bagel chains that are expanding to La Jolla, to Tampa, to Charlottesville. But that will never quite be exactly the same as a kettle boiled, slow risen, hand formed bagel. So it's really not the flour, really, and especially the small amount of additives in the flour really aren't what makes the New York bagel great.
A listener asks, if the evidence is from such old studies, why act now? Why not have new studies? Science has changed a lot since then, could be better, more effective studies. But maybe since you're the food reporter for the New York Times, maybe you want to talk a little bit about the policy aspect of this. Why is it happening now?
Well, this is really part of a larger movement by organizations like Center for Science in the Public Interest and many others to reconsider this very outdated rule that the FDA uses in order to assess the safety of foods. There is a whole category, GRAS, generally regarded as safe. And that was put into effect in a Food Safety Act that was passed in the 50s so that manufacturers wouldn't have to test things like salt and vinegar and yeast for safety. It was considered this, sort of a shortcut and a sop to manufacturers who were going to have to take on all of these new responsibilities for the foods that they produced. And that has persisted, the grass category, into today in ways that are very problematic because generally regarded as safe, there is a very specific way that the FDA assesses whether an ingredient is or is not, but they're really not equipped to do the kind of longitudinal testing to see the safety of something like potassium bromate. So it just kind of becomes a default. This is generally regarded as safe. And, I think we've learned that generally regarded.
Julia Moskin is a food reporter for the New York Times. Thanks so much for your time today.